Okay. We pulled together just a few slides to kind of guide a little conversation, but obviously we want this to be informative and informal. So if you have questions as we go through, as David said, we may save a little bit of time if possible to do some orally, but enter them in the chat feature and hopefully that'll work. I'm going to start very quickly with a look back simply because it's going to affect how we look forward. Obviously, anytime we talk about school issues and school funding, and that will be an issue in 2020 and 2021, we're dealing with the intersection of policy, politics, and law, and politics will be part of this. We will remember in November 2018, our last general election, the margins were relatively close in our statewide elections. There were about 200,000 votes different for the state as a whole. And we did have somewhat of a shift to a slight Democratic pickup in both the Senate and the House. This coming session, or this coming November, we will have half of the Senate up. Probably 2 of those Senate races will be contested, and all 150 of the House seats will be up. And I think probably 12 to 15 of those seats we could broadly identify as contested seats. That's going to be important because it will affect what our world looks like when we get to spring of 2021 during the session and some of the funding issues. I've been keeping up with this for decades. I find it interesting. When we look at our voting age population in Texas, you will see since 2000, we've grown by well over 7 million in our voting age population. Our registered voters has grown by close to 5 million. At our last count, we had 16.2 million. I'm guessing by the time we get to November, our registered voters will be about 16.5 million. So, going to be a lot of potential voters. I think we will have a number of contested races again. Obviously, turnout will be key to everything, and that's about 5 months from now. Now, very briefly, with regard to the budget, something I want everybody to see simply because it affects both public ed and, frankly, it affects higher ed, particularly our state-funded higher educational institutions. If you look at the general budget, this is the budget that's largely supported by sales taxes, oil and gas severance taxes, other general funds. You will note that public ed, which is the gray part, is 42% of the general fund or general revenue. And then, of course, higher ed is 14%. When you move to all funds, you're picking up both dedicated funds and you're also picking up federal funds. And you'll see that the share devoted to public ed and higher ed go down. The share devoted to health and human services dramatically goes up when you begin to include the federal funds. This is important because if we talk about where our economy is struggling right now, it's very definitely in our general fund revenue sources. Sales taxes are off, oil and gas severance taxes are off, and that will create some vulnerability around K-12 education and higher education, again, simply because those two sectors combined account for over 50% of general revenue expenditures. The comptroller's most recent analysis, just kind of looking quarter by quarter, if you compare to April from a year ago, sales taxes are down, oil, motor fuels taxes are down, natural gas production and oil production taxes are down dramatically. Alcoholic beverage tax is down. David, I don't know how to explain this. I mean, I thought everybody would be drinking more since we're all confined at home, but apparently not.
Well, I'm doing my part, David.
Well, okay, good for you. Hotel occupancy taxes are down. These are, the reason I'm flagging these are all big revenue sources that feed general revenue. So the comptroller is telling us, I think he's being very accurate and very appropriate to tell us that the revenue projections looking for 2021, at this point in time, we've got some real concerns. We're going to start with a number of issues. I'm going to start quickly with school calendar issues. Obviously, one of the big questions that we are hearing over and over is when can we start? We do have a statute in Chapter 25 that has been there since 2001 session that fixes the fourth Monday in August as the earliest day for which districts can start. There are some workarounds around that limitation. The most common one is districts of innovation. That process that is Chapter 12A of the Education Code. We have several hundred districts that have gone through that process and given themselves some flexibility over their calendars, and that's probably the most common workaround. There is an option for districts that choose to operate year-round under Section 21.084, but at least on the face of that statute, it's limited to districts that were already operating year-round in 2000, 2001. The commissioner's legal staff has an argument that it might be open to others. We've discussed that with them, and they do recognize that there will be legal challenges if districts try to use the year-round option. The commissioner does not have waiver authority with regard to start date. So District of Innovation probably appears to be the primary option there. Most of the districts we're talking to, in order to provide for some distancing on campuses, are planning for a blend of in-person and remote learning, either using A-day, B-day groups and alternating days. There are some districts that are actually planning to do A week and B week and alternate weeks. They think that gives them more control on a day-to-day basis in terms of cleaning every evening if you don't have a different group of students coming in every day, and obviously transportation alternating to provide some flexibility to manage bus loads will be important. A big issue with regard to these blended models is going to be getting flexibility from TEA for funding purposes. And we want to emphasize that the current TEA student attendance accounting handbook contemplates and funds seat time. It is designed around the assumption of in-person attendance of students. The commissioner has waived those requirements for the 2.5 months of the spring of the 2019-2020 year. He has not yet waived those requirements for 2020 and 2021. So getting flexibility around the student accounting handbook so that districts can design and operate blended models is going to be very important. We fully expect the commissioner will address that, but what that flexibility looks like remains to be seen. Transportation, I think we're beginning to hear that districts may be, the problem is if you're only transporting a reduced number every day because our transportation funding is tied to students transported, $1 per mile per kid. There may be a proration in transportation funding. The CARES Act funding obviously is going to be significant, but I would recommend that districts view the CARES Act money similar to the ARRA funding that the state received in 2009. The state specifically supplanted state revenue in the foundation school program, plugged in federal funds, and then frankly used the state funds that were freed up to fill out other parts of the budget. I think that's going to happen again. So if you've seen any kind of information from TEA showing you the district by district CARES Act money, I would be very careful about spending those dollars or budgeting those dollars. I frankly think to the extent possible, the state is going to sweep those dollars, use them at the state level to plug the budget. I think we can get through 2020 and 2021 pretty well But I frankly expect the 2021 legislative session to be using federal funds to plug into the foundation school program, free up state funds for other parts of the budget. So I'm not sure, and I'm frankly not optimistic about what portion of the CARES Act federal dollars will actually ripple through to districts as a net increase in funding. Some of the issues districts are going to have to be prepared to deal with during the year. We may very well, if we have another resurgence, have a closure for some period of time. I know we're all hoping that is not part of the 2021 year, but there may be districts that have to close specific individual campuses for some part of the year. And again, a watchword for this year is going to be a need for flexibility, particularly from TEA for some of the regulatory requirements, particularly the student attendance accounting handbook, because that is so closely tied to funding. I've been working closely with TASPO, our firm has. We're talking to Amanda, Janae, the folks there about trying to come up with some appropriate ideas on how to address funding if we're not going to strictly use seat time, but give districts the options as you may need them to do some mix of in-person and remote or distance learning. David, I'm going to stop there because we're going to make a transition, but see if you have any questions or anything we need to talk about.
Well, I have one question. Is there a swell in the medical community that would support opening schools back up for face-to-face instruction to allow for the herd immunity that has been touted as a benefit to us all? And this from Chris. Frankly, we believe we need to get back to normal, and the parents in his community, yep, White House, are begging for that option due to child care and job responsibilities.
Yep. The medical community is not yet recommending simply open things up and move towards herd immunity. And the reason, frankly, are the sheer numbers. And I'll just give you some information, and we get information. Janet and I are here in our Houston office, and I get information regularly. I'm on some distributions from the leadership at the Texas Medical Center, so we're seeing some of their thoughts. Here's the issue with simply kind of taking the Swedish approach and saying, well, we'll just let things roll until we get to herd immunity. As a country, and obviously it may be a little different in particular states or particular communities, but we do live in a mobile society, so we need to think broadly. To get to herd immunity, you need to have at least 100 million individuals in the United States who have been exposed to and contracted COVID-19. To get a broad enough saturation so that you're approaching herd immunity. And that's simply herd immunity is you've had enough people infected who have some form of antibody that it inhibits the spread of the disease. And if you get to 100, then you're looking at your fatality percentages. If our fatality percentages are anywhere in the 1% to 1.5% range, then frankly, 100 million infected individuals would translate into 1 million to 1.5 million deaths. That's kind of the cold equations, if you will, of simply moving towards herd immunity as opposed to trying to inhibit spread. Until we have both a vaccine available and we have some treatment options, kind of like the flu analogy is Tamiflu, till you have some treatment options to mitigate the severity of effects. So that's the mathematical problem with simply saying let's roll and move towards herd immunity. If you have 100 million infected individuals, are we as a society prepared to cope with 1 million to 1.5 million deaths? I think the medical community would very definitely say the answer to that question is no. At this point in time, I do think if everyone wears masks, rigorous hand washing, et cetera, you minimize exposure. CDC obviously is recommending masks. But that's the mathematical problem with the herd immunity approach. Okay. It's just the numbers.
One other question, David, and this is one that I have. You work closely with the legislature. You're considered an expert witness on almost every subject, especially anything legal and financial. Do you think there will be any support for using the rainy day fund to offset the decrease in general revenue in order to support education in the next session?
I do believe they will use both the federal funds, which are one-time funds, and some funds out of the rainy day fund. I don't expect them to empty the rainy day fund, but I do expect, and I think there will be an openness to using rainy day funds to try to mitigate and keep schools funding. I think our big question, if you think about 2009, 2011, we didn't have big cuts in 2009 because we did use the rainy day fund and federal funds to keep us whole in 2009. We gambled on the economy recovering by 2011. When the economy didn't recover by 2011, we wound up with a $5.4 billion cut. And so really the question is 2021 going to look more like 2009, where we use federal funds and rainy day funds to kind of shore things up? Or is it going to look more like 2011, where there were actual true cuts? Or is it going to be something somewhere in between?
Yeah, well, according to Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst and now Lieutenant Governor Patrick, they did not cut $5.4 billion out of our budget back then, David. Of course, you and I both know that's not true. Another question is, and you alluded to this earlier, is there any discussion about TEA providing flexibility on the 180 days requirement, the 75,600 minutes to take advantage of the additional day school year and half-day funding? Specifically, if a district has 174 days, but the length of the day translate into more than 180 days, could it be possible for schools to qualify for the ADSY next summer to make up COVID slump?
Yeah. I think that is also one. Yeah, I think that's also one where flexibility could be very important. Again, all of these things, there are some, think on 3 levels. There are some, obviously anything that's adopted by TEA as a rule, particularly a commissioner's rule, the commissioner has the authority to waive his own rules. Just like a local school board could waive its own local policies in specific circumstances. Then there are statutes. Some statutes, the commissioner actually has waiver authority through Section 7056 to waive statutory requirements. And then the third bucket is some statutory requirements that the governor has the authority to waive, and he has been doing that some through executive order. He can't create new requirements, but he can waive some existing statutory requirements. And I think a watchword for 2020-21 is going to be flexibility. I think we're going to need it on all 3 of those levels to let us try to function as close to normal as we possibly can, knowing that it's not going to be a normal year. Let me kind of move on. We'll hit a couple of other things. I want to save some time for Janet. There's a little information here about just a couple of court cases I think is interesting. We're going to hear probably in June from the Supreme Court in the Espinoza case. This is the one that deals with the state constitution prohibitions on funding private and particularly private religious schools. I think there's a very good likelihood we'll see the Supreme Court strike down the state court limitations, so that will continue to be an issue. This has been kind of an interesting case out of Michigan. We're still scratching our heads, but it's the first case really since Rodriguez that finds a federal constitutional right to a minimum or basic education of some form. And we'll follow that. That'll be kind of interesting to see how it plays out. Now, personnel, we've got a bunch of issues. Obviously, what do we do about appraisals for the 2019-2020 year? You know, frankly, we're at the end of the year. I think most people have figured that out. Most people have figured out your contract renewals, non-renewals. People have made decisions to pay employees for the remainder of the year to keep our people whole. That made sense because the state is keeping districts whole. A couple of key federal acts. There's the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, became effective on April 1st. This was one of the first acts. It extends FMLA protection to COVID-19, provides for additional both unpaid as well as paid leave time specifically related to FMLA. This runs through December 31st, so it's not permanent. Then you've also got the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, which was also part of that same broad measure passed on April 1st, and it extends additional paid sick leave up to 80 hours for individuals who are affected by COVID, either by having their own illness or by having to care for someone else who is ill. Again, since we have been keeping employees whole, that has not been an issue so far for the most part for 2019-2020. And this act also runs through December 31st, 2020. So we'll keep an eye on whether that's extended or not following that time. Sorry, I hit the wrong button here. Let me get out of that. Here's a little more detail about the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act. Again, just kind of expanding that. I'm going to kind of move on. Here's a little more about the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, some of the details for when individuals may qualify. Now, here's a big question that we're getting, and that's can employers require COVID testing as a return to work requirement for as we start to transition from from remote work back to physical work? Can you make a return to work requirement that your employees get tested and have clear tests? The EEOC's answer is yes on that. You obviously can do it broadly for all employees. You can always test in specific cases if you see individuals manifesting circumstances. We do suggest very strongly doing it in accordance with CDC guidance. And I want to make a point here that the tests, there are two big categories of tests. There are the tests for are you currently infected? And those are the nasal swabs that go all the way up into the cerebellum. And those are helpful to determine if somebody is currently affected. The CDC does not recommend using the antibody tests as a condition to return to work test. Why? Because the antibody test shows if you have had it, you may have had it, you may be over it, you may have developed some immunities, you may not currently have it, and so there's no reason for you to be affected in terms of a return to work. So make sure you're using the appropriate tests if you think about making that a return to work requirement. Test results are confidential. You don't put up a sign in the teacher's lounge, and it's not a substitute for other safety measures in the workplace. I don't know any schools that want to take on the responsibility to administer your own tests. Obviously, how you provide for that in your communities, how those get paid for, will be some practical issues to work through. So far on unemployment compensation, again, that has not been an issue in the large part for school districts. Why? Because the state is keeping districts whole and we're keeping our employees whole. It could become an issue in 2020, 2021, depending again on what happens with funding and if districts have to reduce staff at some point. The CARES Act federal funds does extend some additional federal funds to assist with unemployment comp benefits. Hopefully, again, for the 2021 year, this will not be a big issue for school districts, because as long as we're able to keep our employees whole, then there should not be an issue with unemployment compensation. I do want to note that districts generally are reimbursing employers. We're not insuring or taxed employers. So at least through the end of the year, if we do wind up as reimbursing employers with some unemployment comp claims, there is federal funding to assist with up to 50% of those costs. Now we're going to talk about student issues and make a transition here, and this is where I get out of my depth pretty quickly. And so I'm going to pass the screen to Janet, and she will talk about some of the special ed issues, because we think this is a particular category that districts are going to have to be prepared to address as we kind of think through the summer and think about what return to school in 2021 is going to look like. Janet?
Okay, thank y'all. So there's, of course, lots and lots of issues that we could talk about, but I want to focus on two of them that I think are probably giving your special ed staff a lot of concern, and that is evaluations and the issue of compensatory services. So let's talk about evaluations first. There's three really broad categories of evaluations that I can think of. One would be initial evaluations. One would be reevaluations where eligibility, 3-year eligibility is at stake. And a third category would be evaluations, reevaluations that are just being done to determine extra information or extra services where the student is already qualified and has an IEP in place. So let's take those three, and then let's divide them into two big groups. One would be those evaluations of any of those three that were underway and almost done when schools closed and did not resume. And the other category would be all the rest of your evaluations. The easier group is clearly the ones that were underway and were almost done when normal school operations were disrupted. I'm going to define these as evaluations where there was no more in-person contact that was required to complete gathering the information that was needed for the report. In those cases, I'm hoping that your school districts have gone forward, done whatever else was necessary to complete the evaluation process, prepared their report, and had an ARD meeting, a virtual ARD meeting, to look at the results of those and take whatever decisions were necessary. If it was an initial evaluation that was almost completed, you had a 45 school day timeline. We know from looking at the guidance that TEA has put out that it appears that TEA is treating as school days those where the status of your district was closed instructing or open. So for the period of time that you were closed and didn't fit that category, and then you became closed instructing or open, your staff should have been able to calculate how many more school days they had left to finish that report, and then have an ARD meeting by 30 calendar days after that. The much harder group to deal with is those where in-person contact was required and is required to complete the evaluation. And so let's look at our three categories, and let's address initial evaluations first. You may have had a request for a special ed evaluation come into your school district while your campuses have all been closed. TEA's guidance has been very clear on that we cannot fail to respond to the request because our campuses are closed, and we cannot and should not deny the request because the initial evaluation can't be completed by that 45 school day timeline. We know that when a parent makes a request, let's say the 1st of April, you got a request in for a parent to do an initial evaluation of a student. We have 15 school days to respond to that. And so you need to be looking at your status of your school district. If you're closed instructing or open, then those are school days according to TEA's timelines. And so that would be the way you would be calculating your days to respond to a parent request. If the response is yes, the district intends to do this evaluation as you have requested, then your staff would be working with the parent virtually to explain the process and get informed parent consent. Then I'm hopeful that your school district staff have provided a prior written notice to parents, informing them at that point that you cannot meet the 45 school day timeline and explaining that it's due to the pandemic, the fact that schools are closed due to the governor's order or local orders, and the need to protect people from the spread of COVID-19. And then that prior written notice would also include information that a plan is going to be developed when normal operations resume to get that evaluation completed. If the response to the parent is no, we're not going to do an initial evaluation of your student, then you'd be providing that parent a prior written notice explaining why the district has declined to do that evaluation. If you had an initial evaluation that you already had consent and perhaps it was in line to begin, or maybe it had just been minimally started, then what we've advised people to do is to provide a prior written notice to the parent explaining that it cannot be completed within the 45 school day timeline and explaining why. Again, there's standard information that you can develop. We've developed a lot here, and I think there's some even posted on our website explaining what the circumstances are and that in-person evaluations are not possible due to protecting the health of the students' parents, the staff, the community at large. Also, that prior written notice would indicate that a plan is going to be developed as to how the evaluation will be completed as soon as it's possible to have in-person contact with the student. Then you have your 3-year reevaluations where eligibility is an issue. So a kid is coming up on 3 years and you're going to decide if that student is still eligible for services or not. Our advice to people has been that during this period of time that the members of your ARD committee, remember we don't have to have an ARD meeting to do this, do a review of existing evaluation data and make a determination that eligibility and services are going to continue while schools are closed during this period of time. That reevaluation, that read, the group may come to a determination that there's no new testing that's required, or the group may come to a determination that new testing is required in all or some areas. And so whatever the result of that is, you'd be sending out a prior written notice to the parent, advising them of that. And if new testing is going to be required, again, a plan on how when school begins, how you're going to get that testing done. Then that third category we talked about are reevaluations, but they're really where it's usually the ARD committee has requested additional evaluation of some kind. So again, sending a prior written notice to the parent, notifying them why the evaluation has been delayed, and that a plan will be developed when school begins to complete all these evaluations. The other big area with regard to evaluations is when you are able to do in-person contact with students to begin to do these evaluations, you're going to have to prioritize them. In large school districts, we're talking about potentially hundreds and hundreds of evaluations that are going to be sitting, waiting to be done. So one big issue is not to be paralyzed now. TEA put out some guidance on evaluations, and they had a chart in the back with all sorts of types of information noting what could be gathered. There are things that assessment teams can gather now and analyze that become a part of the eventual evaluation report. So I think in developing a plan, it would be good. Let's say you've got Sally Smith and hers is an initial evaluation. And so you develop a plan for Sally Smith that identifies all of the information that needs to be gathered for the evaluation of Sally Smith to be complete and valid. And then you figure out, of all that information, what is already available, and of what is already available, is it accessible now for us to be looking at and analyzing? And then a column on, all right, if it's not available or it's not accessible, what's our plan for getting that particular type of information? And then the final column will be who is responsible for gathering that particular type of information. And if you can develop a plan like that on each student, then you have a handle on what you need to do when school begins to get the information that's needed to finish these evaluations. Also think about the 3 types of evaluations that we talked about. So in prioritizing those, perhaps you want to think about completing your initial evaluations first, because these are students who have not yet been found to be eligible. And if they are found to be eligible for services, then these are kids who have not been getting any services while schools are closed because they weren't eligible up to that point. So you might want to prioritize getting initial evaluations done first, having them at the head of the line. Then perhaps reevaluations where eligibility is an issue, and then the other evaluations where the ARD committee is seeking just additional information of some kind. TEA, in dealing with all of these issues, really emphasizes over and over again the importance of communication with the parents and letting the parents know what is going on, what the plans are. I have talked to some directors around here who are trying to develop a letter that would be sent to parents that would explain to them on the front end, this is what we need to do, and this is our plan for how we're going to do it, how we're going to continue to gather the data and begin to prioritize when schools begin, so that parents have some idea of what to expect and what to be looking for that's going to happen with their particular student. The other broad area I wanted to talk about just a few minutes was this issue of compensatory services. TEA has put out guidance on that, compensatory services and ESY. It's all in the same document. I happen to think that the use of compensatory services to describe what's going on is wrong. The term comes from case law that's developed over time under IDEA, where the law gives the court, and the interpretation has been it also gives to the hearing officer, the right to develop any relief that's necessary to remedy a failure to provide a free, appropriate public education to a student. It was developed in cases, every single case deals where the school district didn't develop an appropriate IEP or didn't carry out the IEP appropriately. There's been some kind of failure on the part of the school district with regard to the provision of FAPE. None of those cases are applicable in a situation like this, where there's been a nationwide pandemic and a closure of all schools, I suppose every school district, every public school district in the United States. We've used the term COVID response services. It doesn't really matter what you call it. TEA is going to call it compensatory services, period. We've had some communications with them and they have chosen to use that term. But just keep in mind that before now, that term meant that there had been a failure in some way for the school district to provide FAPE, and that is not what we're dealing with now. And in fact, TEA's guidance does have some language like that that indicates that this is something that the schools didn't have any control over. The guidance from TEA, so when you look at the case law on compensatory services, there's 2 schools of thought on how you determine that. One of them is called a quantitative, which is like an hour for hour. You missed giving my student 10 hours of speech therapy this year. You owe him 10 hours of speech therapy, a quantitative process. And the other one is called a qualitative process. So what is necessary to provide the student now to bring them up to where we would have expected them to be? one very good thing in TEA's guidance is that it says that this should not be this process that the school needs to go through, should not be a process of determining an hour by hour or minute by minute makeup of services. And that's good, because when you really think about doing that, I don't know how you could do that. To me, that's impossible to think about. We're going to make up for every minute of services that have been lost during this period of time while schools were closed. So what the district is going to have to do is determine what is necessary to provide to the student to mitigate the impact of this loss of services on the student's progress. It may be that there's going to be situations where that assessment leads to a conclusion that no extra services are needed, or the assessment may lead to the conclusion that extra services are needed. So there's got to be an analysis of something. And what I have talked to most directors about, and I think this fits with TEA's guidance, is determining where was the student when schools were closed. So what's our present level of academic achievement and functional performance? Where was the kid functioning when schools were closed? And then where is the kid functioning when schools resume again, assuming we resume in the fall? And there's got to be some data gathering. So where the student was functioning when schools closed, you'd be looking at all of the data that existed in the classroom at that period of time: classwork, grades, discipline, behavior, the MAP test, curriculum-based assessments, whatever it is that the teachers would be using to assess what is the performance of their students on an ongoing basis. When school begins again, it seems there's going to have to be another gathering of data. So where is the child at that point? And I don't think it can be on the first day of school. It's going to have to be after school has been in session for a while. So think of it similar to if you have a procedure that your teachers follow, where maybe 2 or 3 weeks into school, they do an assessment to determine where kids are functioning as compared to where they were when school ended. And you use that as part of your process in determining later on by the ARD committee whether that's a student that needs extended year services. So we're talking about gathering that data. Where was the kid when schools closed? Where is the student now when school opens? And then doing an analysis of that. If they've lost progress, what is needed to make up for that lost progress? That's a process that's going to have to be determined by the ARD committee. If there's extra services, they need to go into the student's IEP. TEA says to be practical about what you're doing and consider the effect on the student and on the family. Don't overload them, and monitor over time how the student is doing as far as making up that progress. You may need to be thinking outside the box to do things completely different than we've done them before when we're talking about these extra services. So we always think about with our special ed kids in the summer, they're doing extended school year services. And TEA has made it clear that that's a completely different analysis than what we're talking about these extra services. But maybe you have services after school for students. Maybe you have services during what would traditionally be vacation time. Maybe you develop summer camps for your students in various, like a reading camp or a math camp or a science camp that would help them catch up later on. Maybe you're considering summer services. TEA has put out that guidance on possibly having some in-person services in the summer. And for your special ed kids, if that is something you're thinking about doing, you might consider prioritizing that to those who have lost the most during this time. So rather than kids who've been in general ed classes with accommodations and some in-class support, you would think about bringing in kids with very significant academic delays, or those who have disabilities that really make virtual instruction almost impossible, or their experiences at home or their circumstances at home make virtual instruction impossible. And so you might prioritize your services this summer, if you're thinking about offering any of those in person, to focus on those kids who would be least likely to benefit from virtual instruction that's been going on. This can be a very difficult process. There's no doubt that it is. And I think, again, like TEA emphasizes over and over again, communication with parents is key. And I also think documentation is key. At some point, we're going to have, I believe, a flood of due process hearings, and documenting what you've been doing and documenting what's going on with the kid is the way eventually that we're all going to be able to tell our story to a hearing officer. So, David, that's what I have on special ed. Do you have any questions?
I guess I have one, Janet. Have you experienced a lot of due process questions and parents from advocacy or advocates for special needs kids during this time?
Some, less than I had expected. The ones we have one right now that's, demanding hour for hour for some dyslexia instruction that her special.
You were on an ARD this morning.
Yeah.
Virtually.
Yes. Yep. I mean, your staff have been having virtual ARDs, I'm sure, all over the place. So there's some. I think people are still trying to get the lay of the land. There's been some class actions filed. There was one filed in Hawaii against the Department of Education, trying to get them to set some standards for compensatory services. Just recently, there was a class action that's been filed in Pennsylvania. The teachers union in Chicago sued the Chicago Public Schools and the Department of Education, trying to force the Department of Education to waive the IDEA timelines. So it's out there, it's brewing. I think it's going to come, but I still think people are trying to figure out exactly what to do. I mean, to file a due process hearing right now that claims, you're owed 50, 60, 80, 120 hours of compensatory services doesn't look very good. I think it will be later on in the fall where we're going to see those.
Okay. But you can't expect the federal government to be lenient towards school districts if you do get a lot of these due process hearings after the school year begins.
No. So the National School Boards Association and the American Association of School Administrators, at least those two have sent very detailed letters to the Department of Education asking for waivers of some of IDEA timelines. That was before Secretary DeVos had to make her report to Congress on what she would suggest waiving. She ignored those letters. The only request she made is that for kids who are going to turn 3 that are moving from early childhood Part C services to Part B, continue their Part C services until in-person evaluations can occur. All the rest of the requests that were made by those school groups were ignored.
Thank you.
David, I know a couple of other things. Let me mention quickly. One thing districts should be preparing for, we've been advising a number of districts about, is the issue of reasonable accommodation when you do return to in-school working. We do expect districts will get some requests from employees for reasonable accommodation under the ADA. So just be prepared to think about and work through that as to what might be appropriate, if at all. A couple of things to keep in mind. The EEOC has not said that COVID-19 itself is a disability. Think of it as a serious illness, like a serious case of flu. You have it for a period of time, but then hopefully you do recover from it. So they have not said that COVID itself is a disability. But what you do have are individuals who have other serious medical conditions that increase the severity or the risk to them if they do contract COVID-19. Heart conditions, diabetes, et cetera, where the severity or the morbidity of COVID-19 dramatically increases. Those are individuals that maybe historically have not had to have an accommodation to be able to come to work and do their jobs, but they may now ask for it. And so we've done a lot of research. We're prepared for that. The EEOC has never said that age itself is a qualifying disability for reasonable accommodation. But think about the fact that the severity of COVID-19 obviously is much greater just statistically on older individuals, and there very well may be requests for reasonable accommodation from some of that population, or with individuals who have other health conditions that you've not had to make accommodations for in the past, but now who raise that issue. So if that does come up, we've done a lot of research about it, and that is something we're advising districts to think about. Graduation, I think you've all probably already figured that out. Whatever you're doing in person or virtually, districts are making their decisions based on what they can accommodate. A point I want to make about testing, just so that I'm not misunderstood earlier. You can require testing of employees as a condition to physically return to work if you wish to do so. You cannot generally require testing of students. That for students, this is a search. Think of it like any other kind of search that you have to be careful about. So at least at this point in time, we have not been given any kind of guidance from EEOC or any other group indicating that generally testing students would be permissible. We do have requirements in public schools around students being required to be vaccinated to return to school. That's not obviously going to be an issue in August and September at the start of the 2021 year. At some point in time, a vaccination hopefully will become available. I think the issue we ought to be prepared for is there are exceptions in our education code for individuals to have vaccines either for religious purposes or simply for personal choice. But there is a little known rule adopted by the Department of Health and Human Safety that the commissioner of HHS, in the event of an epidemic, may suspend that right for individuals to opt out of having required vaccines for either religious or personal reasons. That's obviously a very political issue that I would expect will get some attention during the legislative session. I don't know that anybody has made formal decisions yet about extracurriculars and co-curriculars. I know UIL has put out guidance on when kind of conditioning programs can resume. The conversation I've had with a number of districts is they're kind of in some circumstances waiting to see what the colleges and universities choose to do. I just don't know about football and other contact sports in particular. When we get to the fall, I think obviously those are very important to communities, very highly desired, but obviously the risk of exposure goes up. We've already talked about attendance. There have been some surveys done that as many as 20% of parents surveyed have indicated they're going to be cautious or reluctant to return their children to school immediately, that they may wait and see how things shake out. That obviously has a potential huge impact on funding since we are funded on attendance. So again, that drives back to our funding issues and waivers from TEA and things of that nature. Frankly, if the state surreptitiously wants to save money, they simply fund us on attendance, and if attendance is naturally down some because of some parental reluctance, that accrues to the benefit of the state. So that's an issue I want to watch. The commissioner does have authority in the event of a disaster to hold districts harmless on attendance, but it is not a requirement, and it is subject to funds being appropriated for that purpose. So I'm really want to keep an eye out this fall on attendance, the attendance accounting handbook, the relationship to funding, flexibility to districts for different arrangements, things of that nature. We've already talked about calendar. I know we're getting close to our end, and we know because we work so closely with schools. And by the way, a majority of our attorneys at Thompson and Horton are, children of teachers, parents of teachers, former teachers ourselves, spouses of teachers. We do this not just as a job, but because it's something we care about and believe in. And we do know how important returning to some sense of normalcy is to communities. I think Chris made the comment earlier about key for having just that safe, secure environment for children, how important that is for the adults then to be able to return to work and get back to their activities. But we've got to do that in a very safe way. We have not had outbreaks much in schools this spring simply because schools have been closed. But the analogy I want us to think about is what we've seen in a few churches. And I was simply looking at one while Janet was talking, that it was a congregation of roughly 150 people. They met. The minister and his wife were both infected, didn't know it. They wound up with over 65 members of that congregation infected and 4 deaths. Now, 4 deaths out of 150 is a really high percentage. And so obviously doing this in a safe and secure way is going to be important, because what we don't want are outbreaks that alarm parents and result in kids being withdrawn from school. And again, that affects attendance, affects our desire to return to normalcy. An unusual thing about COVID-19 is compared to other viruses, is the extended period in which people may be infectious but be asymptomatic. And with most viruses, when you are infectious, there is some symptomatic manifestation at the same time. And that lag time is what is making COVID so difficult to deal with. We won't know the impact of some exposures until 10 days to 2 weeks after. So far, we have seen very little fatality among young children, and that's a wonderful thing. Obviously, there have been a few cases that have been reported. Statistically, that's not where the large numbers are, but children, of course, could be carriers and be transmitting the infection to older individuals with higher risk factors. So a lot to think about. We obviously, there's that great desire to return to school in something approaching normalcy in 2021, but doing it in a safe and secure manner, and particularly avoiding an outbreak that then, causes just a relapse, so to speak, in a way, is going to take some planning on the front end. Again, we have a lot of information on our website at COVID-19 resources. It's on our homepage. Feel free to look at that and use any of those that may be helpful to you. And then think about this. I've always appreciated some of his works, but the English author Oscar Wilde once observed that everything is going to be fine in the end. If it's not fine yet, it's not the end. And as we think about beginning the 2021 year, it isn't all going to be fine. We are going to have issues to work through. We're going to need some flexibility. We're going to need some support at the state level. But I do believe, that we will make progress when a vaccine is available, when treatment protocols are available to mitigate the severity of it. That's when I think we'll begin to see real progress, and hopefully that will be during the 2021 year. So I think we're going to have to start this year. We're going to do the best we can. We're going to wind up probably having to make a lot of adjustments to circumstances, perhaps during the fall of 2020, and then be prepared for the legislative session in 21. It's going to be a difficult session. Preserving the funding gains made in House Bill 3 is going to be hard. Making sure that any effects on attendance from COVID-19 don't wind up permanently impairing or undermining funding for schools. These are all going to be important issues and things we'll need to continue to work together on. David, I know we're close to our ending time. We'll stop and see if you have any questions for either Janet or me.
Well, David, we don't have any. Well, let's see. There may be one question here. Chris says, it is unrealistic to expect elementary students to learn online at home and in some cases without supervision. Do you know of any schools out there that are preparing to serve those students in a manner that sounds reasonable? Now, I know we're nearly at our time, at our end time, and I wanted to put that out there. But as you prepare for the 3-hour back to school Zoom meeting at the end of July or 1st of August, that is something that we need to know about. In addition, David, you remember after 9/11, we had all the anthrax being mailed around, and I experienced teachers that they thought chalk dust was anthrax, and they didn't want to come back to work, so they wouldn't come to work, and you have to deal with that as a personnel issue. That's one thing. The next thing is, if we can't test kids before they come to school, can we take their temperature when they come to school? And then if we find they have an elevated temperature, do we have to have a holding cell not a cell, but a holding place for them separate from the other kids, especially if their parents are working finally again? So there are a lot of the logistics I'm sure you will address, along with what schools are planning to do, and we'll have more time to do that. It's not Oscar Wilde, but I saw one church that had on their sign out in front of the church, "Remember, this too shall pass away. It might pass like a kidney stone, but it will pass." So it's not going to be a painless endeavor for the next several months or year. But we really appreciate you and Janet for providing us with your insights. And then we look forward to scheduling with y'all for a more in-depth presentation and 3-hour presentation, have the commissioner present, other operational superintendents participating maybe. But just hearing about all of the different aspects of a school that have to be considered and what the best protocols will be for school districts to best serve their students, their employees, and their parents and community members. So thank you.
Thank you, David. And those are, we'll talk about those in more detail in the future, but you've nailed it. Elementary kids and special ed kids, it's hard to deal with remotely. It not only because of the nature of the instruction you're trying to provide, but because frankly the impact it sometimes has on families that they're not able to work remotely. And there are some districts that we're talking to that are talking about some variations, and we'll probably have more information on that by late July, early August. And then again, we'll get through it. William Faulkner once said, "We will not only endure, we will prevail." And I think that's got to be our attitude as we start into the year. It's not going to be the easiest year. TRS is already thinking there may be an uptick of retirements, particularly among older individuals who simply do not want to run the risk of being exposed. So we're going to have a number of issues to start with as we move into the 2021 year. We do want to say to all districts, we appreciate the work y'all do. We know the importance not only for children, but for communities. As a law firm, we're always honored to do whatever we can to support you and assist you. Janet, any closing comments?
No, just thank you and good luck, and we'll all figure it out some way.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. Thank all you folks
Great
who
to see y'all.
attended today.
You guys.